Okay, cool. All right, so higher order functions. We've talked really most data types up to this point, except for functions. And functions are unfortunately, one of the most commonly used things in JavaScript. Almost everything that you write is either going to be a function or it's meant to be used as part of a function, right? Functions are the things that actually does things in JavaScript. You call a function so that you can effectively kind of execute a bunch of commands for a given input, and really they lie at the heart of how JavaScript and how most programming languages really work. So when we think about functions, they may seem kind of big and scary at first, but realize that they're actually not any different than anything else in JavaScript. They are like every other value in JavaScript, with obviously very certain caveats. But for the most part, in terms of how they're used, how they're passed back and forth, how they're assigned, we can treat them very much like we do numbers, arrays, and strings, much like anything else. So functions, if there's one thing you take away from this particular lesson, it's just that functions are also just variables. They're also just values in JavaScript, like all the other data types that we've covered so far. The last bullet here is that JavaScript are first-class objects, which basically means they are a non-primitive data source or non-primitive data type, much like arrays and objects are. But other than that, you should think of them as just like anything else, right? So when I say here's a function, in your mind, you can think of it as like, oh, here's an object or here's an array, in the sense that they don't do anything special or are not anything special more than the other types. So we've seen quite a few examples of functions so far, right? And when we look at something like this, obviously, we didn't print out the commas or the quotes here, but one of the things that we know that we can do here is, it's really easy for us to create an array and then push things into the array, right? In this case, we have an array and a string, and we basically push the string into the array 3 times. Each time we do it, we're creating a copy of the string, right? Because remember from Thursday, strings are primitive data types, which means whenever we make a reference to it, we actually are not referring to that copy of the string. We're making a brand new copy of the string that we use in later instances. And so therefore, when everything's said and done, we have our array up top to our left of 3 happy strings. Here, the point there is that, with strings, if I say, let's put it into an array, you might be like, great, that makes perfect sense. I have an array of 3 strings. Well, if I'm telling you that functions are also just like strings, just like arrays, just like objects, in that they are also values or data types, you can just kind of use and maneuver as such, there's nothing that really stops us from doing this too, which is to say that, hey, we have amazing array. We have a function here called happy function. Let's push happy function into the amazing array, right? And so when we print it out, the printing out for functions look a little bit strange. It basically looks like that. Just notice that this is how functions print out in console logs. These brackets around functions are not indication that this is an inner array. This is just how functions are printed out. So it's more like a human condition, more so than a programming one. But yeah, once you print out amazing array, we have an array once again with 3 elements, and each of the element is going to be a function. Okay, so just one example of how we use functions, or how we can use functions back and forth, much like how we use any other data types. Here, we can also create the amazing array with this instance as well, right? Where we actually just create we use brackets to create an array, and we just write happy function, happy function, happy function. And this will do the same exact thing as the previous slide, where we're creating an array of length 3, and each of the elements in that array is going to be the function itself, right? So this does the exact same thing as the previous slide, except now we kind of get into this distinction of kind of like not the one thing, but the most important distinction between a function and any other data type, right? Which is a function we can treat as a variable, yes. But what's the other thing that we can do with functions that we really can't do with anything else? Call it, invoke it, right? In JavaScript, and I'll say this now, and I'll probably need to say it again a few more times over the course of the day, but in JavaScript, at least for this class, the only way to invoke a function, the only way to call a function, is with the open and close parentheses. As in, if you don't see the open and close parentheses, you're not calling a function. You're more like just referring to it as the variable itself, right? So like one example that I used to give that's probably doesn't work out very well is kind of like a jack in the box, right? Like if you don't crank the jack in the box, it's just a box, right? And so whenever we refer to a function without calling, it's saying here's a box, here's a box, here's a box, right? When we call the box, we actually crank the box and the jack in the little clown thing comes out, right? And so that's, I guess the distinction there is that like there's a really big distinction between kind of what the function is, which is just an object or a variable, versus what happens when we actually invoke it, when we actually have it do something, right? And when we have it do something, it's going to return a value, and that's where the return really comes in and becomes a lot more valuable. And so just kind of wrap on this slide here. So once we've created our variable called amazing array, which is an array with three things, we then are able to loop over the array like we do any other things. And then we say let element equal amazing array index I, right? This is something that hopefully by now we're familiar with, is that it basically lets us get access to each individual element. And notice how on line 12 here, once we have access to each element, what we do is on line 12 is we say element and we use the open and close parentheses, which means we're invoking the element variable. Well, what's element pointing to? Element at this point becomes a placeholder for this function, right? So if element is the same thing as this function, when we invoke element, we're basically invoking happy function. And so when we loop through this array, on the first iteration, we go to the first element and we say, we go to the first happy function instance. We capture it in this variable called element and we invoke it. So we print out I am happy. We go to the next iteration of the for loop. We go to the function. We set it as element. We invoke element again. The second I am happy, and so on and so forth until we get to the very end. And so once again, over here, when we create this amazing array, we're treating functions just like any other variables. And even down here within the for loop, we're treating these functions just like any other variables, in that we can obviously treat them as variables or objects, but then they also have this special thing we can also invoke them to get the value or have them do what it is that we want them to do. Yeah.
So if you wanted to do like a break or a continue, are you able to invoke a specific function based on how you would call it in an array as well, the bracket method?
I'm not sure I follow.
So say you wanted to just call one specific function from the happy functions you have up there, like you just wanted the one that was at position 1 to run, and you're doing your for loop.
Yep.
Can you call based on bracket notation just for that one function when you invoke it? Like instead of just open brackets and kept calling all of them?
Okay. So what should I be typing here,
So
or like what are we trying to test here? Yeah, sorry.
In between the brackets of element, maybe like bracket 1.
In between the, sorry, let me just delete all these question marks here. Okay. Okay. So give me a line number.
Line 8.
Okay. Sorry, line 8. Okay.
Well, now line 9.
Say that. Okay. Yep.
Bracket 1.
Do I remove this line? Bracket
1.
like that.
Yeah.
What's bracket? What's this?
That would be the second happy function.
Well, this is just an array with one element in it called 1. There's nothing that ties this to anything else on this page.
So that's not like one of the index 1 in the amazing array?
Well, where's amazing array? Right? You're just. I mean, like, oh yeah. Zoom in a little bit. But here, like, if this is what you wanted to do, right? Like, this is just an array with a number in it.
I thought that was calling the function.
Element is calling the function.
Right.
But why are we passing into this function an array?
If you didn't want to call all the functions in the array, if you only wanted to call one specific function.
Well, so I guess, okay, I think what you're asking is, can we do something like this, right?
I guess.
Well, so here's kind of like the main caveat here to what you're saying, right? Is this on line 9? It's in this for loop, right? So when this for loop runs 3 times, this is going to run 3 times, right? And so when actually a few things. What you're saying is essentially equal to something like this, right? Let x equals 1, and then let's pass an x, right? This is identical to what you just said, right? X in this case, what is X?
The happy function at position 1.
What is X here?
An array of 1.
An array of 1, right? There's nothing in here that tells me this ties into anything else on this page, right? If I was to say let X equal amazing array index of 1, now I'm saying, oh, I'm using bracket notation to access the first element in this amazing array.
Okay.
Right? If I delete this part, this is just an array of 1, right? Just like how if I add a 2 or a 3 to it, this is just like those are just plain arrays, right? So that's the first thing. The second part of this also is when you put it in between this element, what are you doing?
You're calling it.
No, you're passing this variable in as an argument to element, right? So by putting this in between this element, between the two parentheses, you're not doing anything to the x. You're just literally just shoving it into the element function. You're saying, hey, element function, I think you're expecting something. Here you go.
Okay.
Right. So the caveats there are, one is when we create this is just a plain array. There's nothing that ties this to anything in amazing array, right? This is just a plain array. The second thing is when we pass it into element, we're still invoking element. We're just saying element is expecting this x as an argument, and it doesn't like invoke anything. It doesn't do anything with x other than just pass it along into element. And the third thing is whatever we do in between like 7 and 11, because it's in the middle of a for loop, unless we break the for loop at some point, we're gonna run this like 3 times, right? So to your question of, can I just, if I have an amazing array that I know has 3 functions in it, can I just take out one element and run it once? Then that can't exist really in the context of a for loop because we want to do something only once, not every time for every element in the array. And so if I do amazing array index 1, right, this now goes into the array only once because it's on its own line. It goes into this array once, it finds the second element, which is happy function, and then we can do the open and close parentheses after it, which invokes that function, right? But this I guess like this doesn't do what kind of like these two are not synonymous. Yeah. I'll send this out to the group too. Cool. All right. Any other questions? Yep.
We had the same in workshop. We have the same same problem like this one. We had an object that had methods, and we had to run each. We had to do the for loop in each method and
Yep.
see the function and then call it.
Yep.
So it was like that's.
Yes.
It was a similar scenario like this one.
Yes. In that case, yes, we are treating the functions as values, and therefore we treat them as variables. Cool. All right. I actually think we're almost done with this section here. This seems like a lot of slides, but there's actually not much more new stuff. I think there's more examples of this, right? So, okay. So, yeah. So, once again, the summary of this is, hey, look, we can take functions, treat them like variables, put them inside arrays, put them inside other functions, whatever it is. And then lastly is, if I ever want to call it, I can invoke it like I do any other variable, right? I can say, let x equal this function. Invoke x is the same as invoking that function. That's like the very short of it here. Okay. Nope, not as fast. Okay, so once again, to kind of go along with the theme that, hey, functions are just like anything else. If I have a function that says logs a type value, I pass in the value, I console log out type of value. If I have a function called logs a type and I pass in a string, when I console log out type of value, I get back a string, right? This hopefully you should be very comfortable with this. Like you should be able to like kind of read this very, very quickly now, but nothing fancy there. However, if I'm telling you that functions are just like any other data type, well, guess what? If I do logs a type and I have a function, I can pass in that function as a variable into logs a type as well. And if I do, I will get back something like function, or I will get back, the type of this is a function.
If you invoked happy function, would it be a string? Can you invoke in the variable placeholder?
Which line?
Line 14.
Okay.
If you put happy function then open parentheses.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So great question. So one distinction to make here is that this is on line 14 as it currently is. When we pass in happy function, we're not saying run happy function and then pass it in. We're saying don't run it actually. Just pass it in directly, right? Like kind of like don't crank the jack in the box. Like just pass in the box as is. We don't know what's in it yet. Just pass it in kind of in its current state. If I was to add the open and close parentheses after happy function, the way JavaScript interprets that is invoking that function is going to take a higher precedence, a higher priority. So what we're going to do is we're going to invoke that function. We're going to see what that function returns, and then we're going to pass whatever it returns into the logs type function. So in that case, what's going to happen here? What's going to print out?
String.
No.
No.
No, sorry. No. Guess again.
It's the type of the value of the function that we called is we didn't add undefined problem. We didn't add any variable. It's just a console log. If we add a variable string, it would return string probably.
This is true. What? I guess I can't do the whole. Anywho, okay. What does this return, everyone?
Function.
Sorry. What does that return?
Undefined. Type of undefined is undefined.
Okay. So you're in the undefined camp. Anyone else?
Primitive.
It's not a type of returns a data type. So your options are going to be number, string, booleans, undefined, null, symbol, function, object. Yeah. So another undefined. Anyone else? Who thinks undefined? What do the other 5 of you think? Sherry, what do you think? String? Okay. Well, let's take this step by step. What does this become here? If I'm telling you that this happy function, like when I run, let me know if you guys can't see the code. By the way, my computer looks great, but like obviously up here it looks different. On line 22, when I run this function, right, I'm telling you right now, like, hey, like JavaScript, there's an order of precedence, right? It's like I have to evaluate this, but if I can do this, if I can do this. So I'm telling you that this highlighted portion, happy function invoke, is going to run first before anything else, right? Because we need to figure out what that is before we do anything else with it. So what does that become? What does that return to me? What does that return to me? What does that return to me?
It shoots out.
What does this function return? The function is between lines 19 through 21. So when I look at this function, lines 19 and 21, what does this function return if I run it? So once again, this is like just the thing that you always just need to be super aware of, right? Console logs and returns are unrelated whatsoever, right? There's no relationship between console logs and returns. Usually when I ask you, what does it return? You're basically going to the function and looking for literally the word return, right? If you don't see the word return, what does that mean? Right. A function always returns something, right? I either tell it explicitly what to return or it returns back undefined. Sound familiar? From Monday and Wednesday and Thursday, right? A function always returns something. When I ask you what a function returns, you're literally going to the function just looking for the word return. If you don't see it, then it means we're returning undefined, right? So right now in this happy function here, yes, it's console logging, yes, it's printing out all these really great things, but we don't see a return statement in here, right? So this could do like a million different things. As long as there's no return, we know that I'm not explicitly telling this function to return anything, and so by default, this function is going to return undefined, right? So when everything's said and done, happy function invoked becomes undefined. And now we're passing in undefined into logs of type. And when we do type of undefined, it basically comes back as, I'll just comment on the thing here, but when I do it, basically this is going to come back as type of undefined is still undefined. It's like kind of one of those, like it's kind of like null, and type of null is null. But actually, type of null is object, I believe. Actually, let me check. there's like one of these weird things where like, yes, object. Okay, unfortunately, but anywho, but yeah, for our purpose in this case, right? Like this is kind of the part where like you need to be very very confident and very precise in your logical deduction, right? Like things need to happen in a very sequential order, and you need to be clear on every single step. Because if you're not clear on what this function returns, then you can't be clear about like what to do with that value once you get it, right? So once again, with the return value, and this is going to probably play a bigger part this afternoon in the workshop, but return basically is what this function gives back. Console log is literally what it shows up on the screen. One analogy I like to think of is if your boss or your teacher asks you to do work, right, or an assignment, the return is what you hand into them as a submission. A console log is like an email update you send them like, oh, hey, I'm working really hard right now, right? Like you can send your boss all the updates you want, but if you don't hand in like a final result or a final project or a final paper to your professor, there's no progress, right? Like there's no value to it, right? So the console log, once again, is just meant for human consumption to make it easier for us to read things, but the return is how is kind of actually passing a value back and forth between in and out of a function. Okay, so kind of getting back to the question I handed, right? The point here is that we can pass in happy function into logs of type, and we'll print out function. Obviously, this is a variable and not invocation happy function. If we were to invoke happy function, then we would finish invoking happy function first, figure out what the return value is, and then we'll be passing that into logs of type. Which we do right here, kind of, right? So in this case, rather than having logs of function, what we have is something called calls of function, right? It takes in a variable called another function, and on line 4, what we do is we invoke that function, right? So basically, whatever function we pass into calls a function, it takes it and says, great, I'm going to call you right away, right? And so we still have our happy function, and so when we pass in our happy function into calls a function, it basically says, oh, great, I have a variable called another function, which points to happy function, and I need to invoke another function, which equates to me invoking happy function, right? If I was to invoke happy function here, right, happy function would then become undefined, and so I'd be passing it undefined here, and so another function will point to undefined, and when I try invoking it, I'll get an error saying I can't invoke undefined, it's not a function, right? So once again, computers, very, very logical. Everything you do, you should be able to kind of explain very clearly what the next step or the next process is.
So if you had between line 3 and 4,
yep,
if you add a bunch of code, right?
Yep.
When you in line 11, when you call that function, first it's going to run all the lines between 3 till the line when you call the other function, right?
Yep.
And then you will call it. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. Just one kind of quick thing here is just creating a function is not the same as calling it. Right? And I really wanted to kind of make that sure that point's clear. Like on line 3 through 5, I'm creating a function called calls a function. On line 7 through 9, I'm creating a function called happy, right? By the time I hit line 10, nothing's happening on this page. Right? Creating a function does not mean I'm running it. Running a function means I'm running it. Running a function is the only way to run a function. Right? So when you see line 3 through 5 and line 7 through 9, like realize like if you're not going through and saying, oh, let me just run line 3. Oh, great, on line 3 I create a function, let's run it, right? A computer needs to explicitly see somewhere on the page where if I say calls a function, it's basically looking for calls a function, open parentheses, close parentheses. If it doesn't see it, then it's saying, oh, great, I created this variable that I never used. Okay, so just creating a function is very different than calling a function. You need to do both kind of distinctly. Cool. Okay, so another example here then. So now we're just kind of building on top of these ideas that we've already talked about, right? We have says hi, which takes in a name and console logs out hi name, says bye, the converse of that. We have a function called calls with name that takes in 2 arguments, a name and a callback. And on line 10, if you see what it's doing is, it's basically, callback is the second argument, right? So the second thing that it gets, it's going to invoke that as a function, and it's going to pass into that the first thing that it gets, the first argument that it gets. So when I do calls with name, Sadie says hi, I go to line 9 now, name is Sadie, callback is says hi. So on line 10, what I'm doing is I'm invoking says hi, and passing in Sadie as a name, which then takes me to line 2, where I console log out hi, and the name that's being passed in that says hi, which is Sadie. So I log out hi Sadie. Similarly, on line 14 there, what I pass in says bye. When I go to call the name is Sadie, callback is says bye. So then I'm invoking says bye with passing in Sadie as the argument. And so I get to line 5, and then on line 6, I'm console logging out bye Sadie as a name. Right? This seems confusing, but like this is the kind of thing where like it's probably just a more familiarity and comfort issue. Like if you take the time and really slowly diagram it out, you should be able to kind of trace this logically through, even if you don't see it kind of right away. But this is a very common paradigm where you're basically passing functions left and right, passing variables left and right, and at some point you're saying, oh yeah, take this variable and run this function with it, or take this function and run it by itself. Yeah.
So does that callback have anything to do with like it's an option in JavaScript where you run it after a certain amount of time has passed, or is that something different?
No, it's not, and that's because this is an argument, so it's a variable name. So this is not a reserved word in JavaScript. In this case, callback is just a variable name because we're passing it as a parameter, so you can call this anything you want. Yep. Yeah. The callback that you're thinking of is more of like a concept or like a colloquial thing. We'll talk about it today. I just forgot if it's in this slide or next slide, but it's not a reserved word. It's more of an idea, like something that just people say to make it a little bit clearer. We'll get there when we get there. But for now, just callback in the previous slide was just a variable name. Doesn't mean anything special. Okay. All right. So another example here. We have a function called addWorld. Takes in a string and returns that string plus world. Notice how now we're in the return line, right? We're out of console log line and we're returning things, which means now we need to be a lot just even more explicit about what we're doing at each step of the way, right? Lines 1 through so if I'm a computer, I go through this page, I hit lines 1 through 3. What happens?
Can you just repeat it again? I'm sorry, we missed that.
Sure. If I'm a computer, I read this code, right? I hit lines 1, 2, and 3. By the time I reach line 4, what happens?
Nothing.
Right.
It gets closer.
Right. Nothing's happened except for the fact that I've now created this variable called addWorld. Right. Nothing's running. Nothing's executing. I've just created a variable. Right. When I hit line 5 through 7, same thing. I've just created this function called calls with hello. Right. Nothing's run. Nothing's being executed yet. I hit line 9, and now I'm actually starting to execute code. How do I know I'm executing code? Well, because I see an equal sign here, which means I need to figure out what the right-hand side of the equal sign is. And the right-hand equal sign is calls with hello. So now I know I'm executing calls with hello. What am I passing into this function when I call it? I'm passing in something called addWorld. Okay? AddWorld, once again, is just a function. I'm not invoking it. I'm really treating it as just a variable, a function, right? And I don't need to know what it does. Calls with hello's job is to figure out what it does. Okay? So when I execute on line 9, I execute calls with hello. Func becomes addWorld, and so on line 6 there, I execute func, which is I execute addWorld. I pass in this string called hello, right? Which is the same as what? As making this string equal to hello. So addWorld, when I execute it, say hello plus world, which gives me hello world. And what do I do with it? I return it, right? I don't print it to the screen, or at least this is a bad example here, but I don't print it. That comes from down here. I don't print it to the screen. I return it, right? As in, and what return basically does is, if you go back to the handing in the assignment analysis, usually you hand in your assignment to whoever gave it to you in the first place, right? So if your manager asks you to do this, after you do it, you give it to your manager, right? If your professor asks you for a paper, you do it and you hand it back to your professor. Same thing here. This string plus world becomes hello world, and then we say, let's return this hello world string. Who are we returning it to? We're returning it to whoever called it, right? And where do we call addWorld? We called it down here on line 6. So this now becomes hello world, and then we're also returning this hello world string. Well, great. Who do we return it to? We return it to whoever initially called calls with hello. And where do we call calls with hello? We called it here on line 9, right? So now this whole thing becomes hello world, and we assign it to the variable result. And so therefore on line 10, when we console log out result, we get hello world up top there. Sure. All right, so if this is a function that we're running here, so I go from lines 24 through 30 up to here, nothing really happens, right? And then on line 32 is kind of the first time where we actually start executing a function. In this case, we execute calls with hello, right? And we pass in this add world function. Well, this basically means between lines 28 through 30, we'll say, it's basically the same as saying let func equal what? What is func equal to at this point, guys? People in the back? Yeah? No? Yes? Jeremy?
What?
On line 29, what is func equal to?
It's world. Yeah, if you see it, the func is the argument of the calls within hello, in this case, right? It's going to be the argument.
Wait, did we hit line 33 yet?
Yeah, we did.
Okay, yeah, so it would be
So,
wait.
yes, it's going to be world because it's the argument of the
What's world?
add world. So add world is the argument of that function, right? Is the function itself is the argument, and then we go inside that function and we see what it returns. It returns the string plus world.
Okay,
So actually,
I think you're way past where
Yeah,
I'm asking right now. Right.
I'm just trying to connect.
Right. No. So at this point on line 29, right, you're all right that func is at world, but I guess this is the kind of thing where you need to be very this needs to be very certain for you, right? Like at this point, especially for this workshop, like the fact that I have a function here and the fact I'm passing in an argument, like, and the argument is basically what I was passed in, like at this point, this should be second nature to you, right? Like when you see that, you should be like, oh yeah, well of course func is at world because whatever is being passed into calls with hello is going to be func, and so I'm passing in at world here to calls with hello, and therefore func must be at world. Right. So I mean, I know I was kind of like making it a little bit painful in terms of kind of like making you doubt yourself, but like these are the kind of things where like you really can't doubt yourself, right? Even in interviews, or I guess especially in interviews, like when someone kind of asks you to use a function, like the fact that you understand how arguments work is extremely important. And so when someone asks you like, oh, like when I call calls with hello, what's func here? Like you feel like this is at world, right? If you kind of like don't know or aren't sure, it basically tells someone like, oh, hey, this person isn't super confident with how functions work, right? So these are kind of things that like over time you really just need to be extremely kind of build up your confidence and kind of recognize it as soon as you see it. One thing that I also say here that I use probably a little bit interchangeably that I should be more careful about is you might hear people use the word argument versus parameter. So in most cases, they're referring to the same conceptual thing. What we call an argument is whatever is being passed into the function. So in this case, add world is the argument for calls with hello. But once we're inside this scope, once we're inside this mini world of calls with hello, then we call func the parameter, right? So in both cases, they're referring to this add world function. But if we're saying, hey, what goes into calls with hello, we're saying what are the arguments that go into calls with hello, and we're saying add world goes into calls with hello, so therefore add world is an argument. Once we're inside calls with hello, then we think of add world or func as the parameter.
What about input? Is input and parameter?
Input is probably more of an English thing. I think when you say input, people know what you mean. But the more like didactically clear term is argument versus parameter. Like argument basically refers to kind of from the outside looking in, and then parameter is from inside looking in, I guess. So. Okay, cool. So we're on line 20. So we hit line 33. And by the way, the only way we can be even in line 29 is if line 33 is executed, right? Because unless line 33 executes, unless we call calls with hello, we never really execute the code inside calls with hello, right? Like we go through once, we create this function, but we don't run this code inside of it. And so because of that, by virtue of being in line 29, we must have called calls with hello at some point on this page already. Okay, so great. So on line 29, func basically becomes add roll function, right? And so when we return func and we pass in the string hello, this is now identical to add world. Hello. Great. So what does add world hello do? Well, let's invoke add world and let's pass in the string, or let's pass in hello as a string. So here, this is identical to us having less string equal what? Great. And so now when we do return string plus world, this actually becomes hello world. If I'm adding two strings, I can just kind of add them, right? So now I'm returning hello world. And where am I returning hello world to? I'm returning hello world to whoever called add world, right? So what do we call add world? We called it here. And so because of that, this add world / hello becomes hello world, right? At this point, though, we're not done with this function yet because guess what? There's a return keyword in front of this, right? So we need to finish. We haven't finished line 33 just yet. But we know all that's left to do is return hello world. And so now the question becomes, where did we call calls with hello? Well, we called it on line 36 here, right? And so now this becomes hello world, which is why when we console log out result, we get back hello world. Yeah. Do you have a question still? Or sorry, do you have a question still? Or
Oh no, I'm sorry.
oh, cool. So I think I shared this already, right? Same one? Yep, great. Yeah, so hopefully now you see why like this like level of detail-oriented approach is super critical, right? Because like if you're not clear on how a single one of those steps work, like you're kind of screwed for every step after it too, right? Like if you don't know what this returns, then you can't say how does that return to something else, right? So like it's like at every step of the way, you just want to be super clear about what your thinking is and kind of what the next logical step is going to be.
Slack, that thing, is it still there?
It is, yeah, it's in Slack already. It's a pesky force one. So it should be the last thing I sent out. I think Repo holds it for a few days. So if you want it, you can copy and paste it in the class. But I don't know if it's like forever though. They might delete it after like a few days or something. Okay. This is probably more akin to the problem that you looked at yesterday with like the calls with all function. Here we're basically saying is, hey, I have a function that's called say to all. I take in two arguments, a names parameter, and a say with name func parameter, right? I go through lines 1 through 5, and honestly, on the first go through, I don't even care what's in lines 2 through 4 because guess what? I'm not running it yet, right? In fact, there's a very good chance I can create this function called say to all and never run it. So why bother trying to figure out what it does just yet? Let me wait until we actually start running it, then I'll look at to see what it does. So I create a function called say to all, whatever. I go to line 7. I have a variable called group. It's an array with 4 strings, 4 names. Cool, whatever. So up until line 8, like nothing's really happening, right? I've created a bunch of variables. Nothing's being run yet. I get to line 9. Once again, I have this function called say hello with name, takes in a name, but I don't run it just yet. So I go to line 12. By line 12, I've created 3 different variables, but nothing's being run. Nothing's executing on this page just yet in terms of running code. On line 13 is the first time that I actually see a code being run. How do I know a function is being run? Because of these open and closed parentheses, right? Once again, the only way that I know like a function is being run is with the open and closed parentheses. And here, it looks like what I'm doing is I'm invoking the say to all function. Right, I'm passing in group, and I'm passing in say hello with name. What is group? Group is an array of strings. What is say hello with name? Well, it's a function. So when I go up to line 1 here, names become group, right? Or names points to group, and say with name func points to say hello with name, right? And then on line 2, what I'm really doing here is I'm actually creating a very standard for loop. I'm iterating through this names array, right? I'm going through every single element in the names array. And what I'm doing is I'm executing say with name func. I'm invoking that function and I'm passing in whatever the element is at that particular index in the names array, right? So once again, what's say with name func?
That's the second variable of your say all function.
What is say with name func?
Say hello with name.
It's this. Right? Say with name func is this function here. So on line 3, for every element in this names array, I'm invoking this say hello with name function, and I'm passing in one of the elements, Jane, Jill, Pip, or Mike, into this function. And what does this function do? This function takes in a name and console logs out hello name. So when I run this function, on the console log I see hello, and I greet each one of these people in turn. Right. So this is, once again, nothing new here, right? This is just an application of things that we've already known. And this is also a very common paradigm too, where it's like, hey, let me give you a list of things, and let me give you something to do to every one of those things, and can you just do them for me? Right? Very, very common pattern, and something you can be very, very kind of comfortable with in the long run. Yes.
If we return on line 10, if
Yep.
we return the value,
Yep.
it's going to go. So the function will fire for each name, or it will stop after the first name.
It will fire for each name, because what return does is return ends the function that it's in, right? So if I replace console log with return here, and I call say hello with name with the first name, it's going to return hello, hello Jane, right? But that ends this function. It doesn't end this one. So I'll return 4 values. Currently, I'm not capturing anywhere, so the values just kind of goes into the void. But I would still run that 4 times.
So what if you had the return statement on say all?
Where? Which line number?
3?
Sure. So if I had a return say with name func up here on line 3, then I'll still go into the for loop. For I equals 0, I will run the function. I will get whatever value I get back. I'll return it, and at that point, this function is over. So in that case, I will only run it for the first element, probably.
So what if you wanted to return, but then you wanted to close?
Then you don't return. Right? It's like I guess it's like like what if I want to hand in a test, but I don't want you to grade it? Like, well, you just don't hand in the test or don't hand in the paper, right? In JavaScript, return only returns one thing. It depends on what you want the function to output, right? If you are saying like, hey, I want to return all 4 things, well, then you probably want to put it into an array and then return the array of 4 things. If you say, I only want to return the first thing, but I want everything else to run, then what you want to do is you probably want to store whatever the return value is going to be in a variable, run the rest of the code, and then return the variable as the last step, right? So there's kind of where you kind of want to be creative and start thinking through some ways. But yeah, return is always going to terminate the function. So don't have anything after return that you want to run, because it won't run. Like JavaScript won't even look at it. It just ended there and just move on. Yeah.
If you did want to store that information into a variable, that would be like let element equal names at I, and then call from that.
Let element equals names index I gives you access to that element in the array. If you want to return whatever says with name func returns after you invoke it, then you need to say, let x equal that thing. Right? Like it's one of those things where it's like, if I make you like kind of like look at the code line by line and explain it to me, like it needs to kind of like make sense, right? In terms of like if I just say let x equals names index I, well, I'm not calling any function anymore, right? So that's just going to be the element. If I say
it would be all the elements.
okay, so let's say we're looking at this code now, right? If over here on line 41 I say let x equals names index I, what does that tell me, or what does that give me?
Jane, Jill, Pip, and Mike.
Okay, great. And then if I say let x equals this now, and assuming this is return, What does that give me? Or what are the values that x takes kind of in sequence?
Hello, Jane, hello, Jill, hello, Pip, hello, Mike.
Yep, exactly. So that's why, like when you create these variables, right? Like these two are fundamentally different things, and the best way to actually figure out what it is just like maybe not is to make less assumptions and just be like, okay, what is names in xi? What's I? What's the name? And like that's kind of all you need to know, right? Like there's no way x to be every variable because x is just names index I. So once you know what I is, I'm just accessing one element in the names array. Cool. All right. And then this part here is just more of like a nomenclature thing more than anything else. Our favorite anonymous functions. Anonymous as in we can create the function syntax but just not give it a name. So here when I do say to all, in the previous slide what I did was I created a function called calls with hello, right? And I pass it in. Here I can also just pass in the name, like the text for the function directly. Right? When it gets to when we're in, so in this case the argument to say to all is the anonymous function, but the parameter in say to all is still say with name func. Right? So this is just another way to do what we did on the last slide, except we don't need to kind of go through the trouble of creating a variable that we only use once. Yep. Sorry, your question?
Sorry, on that one. So you didn't define your say with name func though.
I didn't define my say to name with func. Say with
the second argument is say with name func, right?
For which function?
For function say to all.
Yep.
You input names and you input say with name func.
Yep.
And then in the bottom you call say to all group function name. So how does the computer know what say with name func does?
Well, say with name func is this function right here.
Oh.
So here's the previous slide. We did this. Oh, Jesus. Okay. Previous slide we did this, right? All I'm doing is I'm basically saying, okay, I don't need the name for you anymore because I only use you once. And I'm just going to copy and paste you and replace you here. Cool. All right. Lastly, there's this calc problem. I mean, this one I probably won't even go through. You just look on it on your own. It's just an extension of what we talked about earlier. I pass in a number, a function, and another number. And so on line 10 there, I'm basically just running that function and passing in the two numbers as inputs, right? So if I call calc and I change operation func to be plus, then operation func is plus, and when I invoke, I'm invoking the plus function. If I invoke calc and I pass in minus as the operation func, then when I invoke operation func, I'm invoking minus. And so this is also a way for you to kind of make your code more flexible in that you have this function that can run mathematical equations as long as you tell it what the inputs are and what the function is. Okay, so I guess we should talk about the idea of a callback. So callback, once again, is just more of like a handy way to talk about certain things. Usually when we talk about callback, we say in context of a callback function. And what a callback function is just a function that you pass into another function that's meant to be run by that function, right? So in in this example of say to all, sorry, in this say to all example, say with name func is called the callback function, right? Because we pass in say with name func into say to all with the expectation that say to all is going to run say with name func for us. Right? So it's a function, a callback function is a function that you pass into another function. Cool? Like there's no like reserved words, there's no like special properties around it. It's If I say, oh, here's a callback function, if I tell someone, oh, I'm going to pass a callback function in, the understanding there is just like, oh, okay, great. That means whatever I pass this into is going to be running my callback function down the road at some point. So why that's important is so this is not important. But one example of us kind of starting to use callback functions is something called for each, and there's a few other examples of this too. But for the for each loop, for each is something that comes built in with the array class. So every array that you ever built is going to have access to using for each. And what for each does is for each actually is a built-in function, right? And the way you call it is you call array.forEach or bridges.forEach. And what you pass into it is going to be a function, right? Notice how log uppercase is a function that takes in a string, and we just console log out that string capitalized. But notice how we pass in log uppercase into for each. We're not invoking it, right? Once again, we're treating it just like a normal variable, right? And so what for each does is, or like on the magic of for each, what it does is it actually is going to take a function in, and it will write kind of the for loop for you to say, great, if you give me a function, I'm going to run this function for every single element in your array for you, right? And so in this case, when I do bridges.forEach, what it's doing is saying, oh, great, you gave me this function called log uppercase. I'm going to run log uppercase on every single element for you. Okay. If you don't want to run it on every single element, don't use for each. Kind of like the for loop, right? If you don't want to go through everything, don't use it. For each is meant in cases where you want to run this function on every single element. Everyone go so far? Okay, great. The other kind of thing here that you're probably just kind of glossing over mentally, which I totally understand why you would, is, well, how do I know what gets passed into log uppercase, right? So that's the second assumption that for each makes for you. For each is going to call whatever function you give it, but it's always going to pass in the same three things into every function. And the three things for each, at least in order, are the first argument is always going to be the element. The second argument is always going to be the index. And the third argument is always going to be the entire array. Okay? In our case, for line 3, when we invoke log uppercase, for each is going to pass into it the element, the index, and the array. Our function only takes in one argument. So basically, it's only going to take in the first argument, which is going to be the element, and say, great, element is the string parameter here, right? For each one, we'll say, well, here's the index and here's the array, but our log uppercase one will be like, nah, it's okay, I don't really need it, right? And so once again, that's what this is doing. So if I wanted to actually kind of write this out for you, if I want to recreate for each, which I think might actually even be one of your problems, if I want to recreate for each, how that will look would be something like this. Oh shoot! I use question marks. Okay, so this is equivalent to doing for let I equals 0, I is less than bridges dot length I plus plus, and then I'll do log uppercase, and I'll pass in bridges index I, passing in I, and then passing in bridges. Right. So basically, line 62 through 64 is the same thing as line 60, and so for each is really more of a shortcut than anything else. Right. But this is what it's doing. And so the reason why we bring this up in this lesson is just to kind of give you the idea like, hey, a lot of times we pass in functions into other functions, knowing that that function is going to call it for us in some way, right? In most cases, when you have a callback function, there's kind of like a set agreement on how this can be called. In the cases of for each, the idea is, hey, I'm going to call this whatever function you give me for every single element in this array, and every time I call it, I'm going to pass in these three arguments in this order. So it's up to you as a writer of the function to make sure that whatever function you pass in is able to handle those three arguments in that order. Yeah, Hubert?
Can you expand on passing in the other two arguments and
Yep.
log uppercase?
Great. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Great. So here, in this case at least, we're only taking in the first argument. So we have string, and then we just capitalize it and we console log it out. So we get these three strings in capitals. On the next so on the next example here, same exact array, except now our function is called log with idx, and we take in two arguments, string and index, and we console log out string is that index idx. Now when I pass in log with idx, what I get printed out is Brooklyn is at index and then the idx is 0.
So
right?
any other, so the first one always takes in an element, and then if you add any other additional parameters, even if it's named instead of idx, then it will give you the index.
Yep. Yeah. Parameters are just variable names, so you can always call them whatever you want. They're never binding. Right, so it's just the first argument is always going to be the element. The second argument is always going to be the index. The third argument is always going to be the array. If you don't need it, don't. Feel free to not accept it, but for each is going to do that for you every time, no matter what.
So the one that you were slacking before, if you ended that at just the index of I and you didn't have the I input or the bridges input, would you still get the same result?
Sorry, can you say that again?
On line 63,
Yep.
If you remove I and bridges from after that first,
Yep.
would you still get the same result?
I would, yes. Yep. But this is more like a how does for each do it, and so I need to kind of keep in convention with what for each does. And this is what for each does every time, right? Like a lot of times you'll see more often than not people just write a function that takes in like what they need. But this also means that if I only want the index, I still need my function to take at least two arguments. I just ignore the first argument and only use the second one. Well, in this case, I would just, if I only care about, if I do like this is at index whatever it is, I have two parameters. One's called string, one's called idx. So string is still the element, index is still the index, and in my function, I just never use the variable called string. Make sense? Yep. Cool. All right. Any other questions? Cool. Sound good. All right. I'm gonna